Welcome to Radiologists, a podcast by University Medical Imaging Toronto, where we discuss the most interesting topics through the lens of Canada's largest medical imaging department. I'm your host, Satish Krishna. For this episode, I'm going to give you a list of a few names, and you try to tell me what's common between all of them. Napoleon Bonaparte, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Isaac Newton, Ludwig van Beethoven, John Keats, Leo Tolstoy, Ernest Hemingway, Charles Dickens, Michelangelo, Vincent van Gogh. All of these are very famous personalities throughout history who have achieved so much. But did you know what unites all of them? All of these famous people suffered from some degree of mental health issues. Now, did they manage to achieve so much despite these mental health issues? Could history have been changed if some of the contemporary approaches to mental health was present in history? For example, could we have prevented the burning of Rome by Emperor Nero? Or could history have been changed because we had King George III of England with some issues? Or could we have prolonged genius? For example, we know about the untimely demise of Ernest Hemingway and Vincent van Gogh, who succumbed to these mental illnesses. How big of a problem is it actually is? And how prevalent is it in the healthcare settings? To answer these questions, we have with us Dr. Louise Harris, who is the inaugural UHN MD Wellness Lead. Louise, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, first things first, we seem to live in an age of epidemics. So we had the COVID epidemic, which is a pandemic. But then we have devolved into calling everything as epidemic. We have the obesity epidemic, we have the drug use epidemic, and then we have other crises like the climate crisis. And then we use the term epidemic for everything. We have an epidemic of car theft in Toronto. We have an epidemic of superhero movies. How big is the problem, the mental health epidemic? How big is it actually? And just because we use terms like epidemic, are we kind of devaluing the problem because these buzzwords are being so overused?
It's unclear whether it is greater than it has been historically, or we are more aware and people are more likely to bring this to light, and there's a greater awareness of trying to solve the issues around mental health and well-being. With respect to physicians, I don't think that overall physicians are any different than the population at large when it comes to mental health issues. I do, however, think that some of the challenges that they face, such as moral distress or second victim syndrome, are somewhat more unique to the physician population.
Interesting. And as physicians, we've been speaking about mental health for almost the better part of the last century, right? However, I understand that in UHN, you are the first and inaugural UHN MD Wellness Lead. How did you get into the whole wellness thing, and when did this start, and what made you get into this role?
I am a cardiologist. I've been at the institution for several decades, and I'm not sure why I was chosen. I think possibly because I was well known within the institution as somebody who I like to think of it that I didn't really have any skin in the game. I had no personal goals to attain, and that was for me more an interesting project
Mm-hmm.
to try to understand the landscape, the why, the challenges, and then to try to be creative about solutions.
Yeah, as a cardiologist, at least like in common parlance, there's a lot of link between the heart and the brain, right? Like we just talk about when we're very happy, or flutter of the heart, or when you're sad, about heartbreak in colloquial language. So maybe that's why you're chosen, because there is a bit of relation there. A lot of physicians feel that it's not okay to be not okay, right? You feel like you're probably a little bit undersuited if you feel very stressed at work, because you're supposed to be very capable. Do you think that this is common across the entire spectrum, or do you think that certain groups are affected more? For example, with men, commonly they feel that they can't voice out their concerns. However, in a healthcare setting, physicians are quite the minority, and they're oftentimes, they feel like to be taken seriously, they need to put up a very strong facade in front of everybody else. And it's also with junior versus senior colleagues, people who are just stepping into the organization, especially the size of the organization. And also, a lot of these world-renowned colleagues around them can make them feel very intimidated and extremely stressed. So, are there differences that you see among the physician populations as well?
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think there are two different issues. So one is the notion that being vulnerable is a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging challenges is a weakness. And I think we should think of it in the opposite context, that to be vulnerable and to identify the challenges you are encountering actually means you have a strong sense of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and that you are confident in acknowledging your challenges. And I think too long the concept has been that you have to be stoic, you have to be invincible, and none of us can sustain that for an entire career.
Absolutely.
I feel, for example, I'm going to give you a very personal example, and that is I lost my husband to ALS, and he died suddenly. And while many people reached out, colleagues within my own cohort, whom I saw on an almost daily basis, could not acknowledge that that had happened. And I don't think it's because they were unaware or they didn't want to say something. I think they didn't know how to say something. And I find now that I talk about it very openly, because it had, no big surprise, an enormous impact on my life
Mm-hmm.
and my work environment. And when the opportunity arises, I will acknowledge that so that other people can understand that it's okay not to be okay in that particular circumstance. And I try to indicate that we are better for self-reflection
Mm-hmm.
and understanding what our strengths are, and trying to acknowledge that we're human and that we can't work 24 hours, 7 days a week. And we shouldn't expect others to do that. At the same time, that's not to say we shouldn't be doing a worthy job, and that we shouldn't be going as far as we can on behalf of the patients. But we also need to understand that if we keep on at that pace, it's not sustainable.
For us, yeah.
So I think, for example, looking at something like second victim syndrome. So that refers to, in particular in the case of surgeons, if you have an operation that has a suboptimal outcome, the impact may potentially be for the patient,
Mm-hmm.
but there is also now widely recognized a secondary impact for the person, the surgeon, who was left creating the suboptimal outcome. And one of the things that I'm hoping we can arrive at is a confidential peer-to-peer support program for that situation. So there is literature written acknowledging that there's an immediate impact, but then there's also a longer lasting, a hangover where people start to question their judgment or try to rationalize what happened. And that we need to understand that that is part of the work that we do, that these things will happen, and we need to find a way to accommodate them and allow ourselves to move forward and continue doing that work. And so it has been shown that having peer-to-peer support programs where you can talk in confidence to potentially a more senior colleague who's been in that situation can really be cathartic for the individual. And I think that's an important aspect that we need to bring forward in a broader sense. The second topic that you raised is that of junior physicians. And there is a body of literature that looks at medical students going into medical school, identifying that they are no more prone to mental health problems or depression or other situations than the rest of their peer group. However, within the course of medical school, that shifts significantly, and there's an increased risk of depression. If you look at, I've been struck often, I will look at the valedictorian speeches of people leaving medical school, and many of them refer to imposter syndrome. And for those who are not familiar with that, imposter syndrome is believing that you arrived at this elevated position of being a physician in charge of other people's well-being, physical well-being, and you feel that you are there under false pretenses, that you don't really deserve to be there.
I feel like you're not worthy.
Exactly. And that is fairly common. And I think if we want physicians to deliver their best, then we need to support younger physicians.
So you speak about the imposter syndrome, which occurs with not just medical students, but I do find that that happens even throughout their career, because as physicians progress in the academic career, they are placed into various leadership positions, and quite often many of these leadership positions comes with responsibilities which you aren't necessarily trained for. And the second thing which I allude to is that the peer-to-peer network to kind of get mental health support. The problem with both of these is that the best way to kind of overcome them is to reach out to people. However, historically, there's always been a stigma associated with mental health. And that's one of the main reasons in the past people didn't reach out to people. And as physicians, we've always been advocating to kind of decrease the stigma. But among the mental health community, do you feel like a little bit of stigma still exists? Because when you ask a medical student with imposter syndrome to reach out to somebody and tell them that, hey, I feel unworthy, that probably it confounds the problem as well. Like they feel very hesitant to do that because that is the problem. And essentially, like a surgeon who might have had suboptimal outcomes, if you ask him to reach out to his colleague, he always is worried about judgment. So do you feel like reaching out still has some stigma associated with it in a healthcare context?
Well, to go back to the medical students, so when I refer to imposter syndrome, I'm talking about people giving valedictorian speeches at their graduation. So these are people who obviously are held in high esteem by their colleagues, and yet they are leaving the graduation with that still very much in front of them. And obviously that can perpetuate in when they start out in their careers. But that, I think, is what I'm alluding to. We need to be aware of that. So we, as senior, mid-career, senior physician, people in leadership, need to understand that and find a way to get the most out of people using supportive language. So What I'm saying is that we, for example, when we have residents on our units, if they are not performing the way you would like them to perform, we need to find a language to deliver that message in a helpful manner that enables somebody to grow. So we don't want to say, well, you did that wrong and you did this wrong. I always preface when I talk with people in training, I try to preface it with what I truly believe, which is I want you, my job is to make sure that you leave this rotation the best person in this area, that the best and most well-equipped individual that you can be. I'm not saying that
Ever give
it
that.
is anybody, but that you can be, and that is our job. So our job is not simply to deliver you are lacking in this area, but really to say, I want you to be the best you can be. And in that context, I want you to try to work on and then, specify the challenge.
So I understand. So if you have a gold standard and then compare them against that, they always feel inadequate.
And
But
there's
then
no
you just
reason to,
exactly.
because we all come with different skill sets. And that leads me to the second part of your question, which is when we find ourselves in leadership positions, and that's what I've been alluding to earlier, is that we need to recognize that historically, the way medicine's very hierarchical,
Mhm.
and it's very steeped in tradition. But we need to recognize that when you're appointing a leader, it's not because they have great research profile or that they have a great skill doing certain procedures. We need to recognize that the people who will make the best leaders have the qualities that it takes to be a leader.
Mm.
And that is another very rapidly evolving concept within this discipline. And there are any one of a number of courses being offered at all different levels, trying to imbue the qualities of leadership and how to be an effective leader within your organization. So I think that's probably been something in the business world for a much longer period of time than it has been in medicine. But I think there's increasing recognition that that is an essential component of having a happy workforce.
When coming to individuals in the healthcare context, what would be your suggestions as to how to ensure your own mental calmness and make sure that you aren't stressed? Because the internet, especially YouTube and TikTok, is rife with so-called mental health advocates and experts. And when you look at any video, it always starts very similarly. There's an inspirational music in the background, and then this person is saying, oh, to take care of my mental health, I always wake up at 4 in the morning, and then I go for a walk for about an hour, and then I come back and I do yoga for 15 minutes. Then I write in a journal for about an hour, and then I prepare breakfast, and this has to be healthy. And then I do this and that, and then I go to work. The whole process seems to take so much time. And one of the main reasons for stress is lack of time, because we're all very busy. And the solution to that seems, oh, devote a much larger chunk of time, which I think is just going to compound the problem. Do you have any ideas or things which people can do to improve their mental health?
There's increasing awareness that for physicians to be mentally well in their workplace, there are two aspects. One, which we've been talking about to some extent, which is the organization within which they are working. And the other is this concept of personal resilience.
Mhm.
And for the longest time, a lot of emphasis was on personal resilience. And whereas I'll come back to talking about resilience or, how you can assist yourself in being well. increasingly there is emphasis on organizational initiatives to support wellness.
Okay.
And that really is, I think, where I come in, that I have to help the organization and the physician body find that common ground where there are changes within the organization that will work towards physician well-being. And I put that out there because for the longest while we have said this is all about individual resilience. And I think that has really been recognized as just one small portion of the problem. With respect to personal well-being, I think that taking care of your physical health is a very important aspect, and that is within your control. And whether, so for example, for myself, I recognize that there are many days that are long and there is work to be done and patients to take care of throughout. But wherever possible, I try to leave the building for 15 minutes for a walk. And that just allows you to refresh yourself in some manner. And I think items like that are important. I think eating properly is important. And I think we are learning so much over time about the connection between healthy eating, microbiomes, and mental as well as physical well-being. And I think people should allow themselves the time and the place to eat properly, even if it's for a short period of time. We spoke about earlier how there is no such thing as a lunch hour in our work days.
Absolutely. Like most radiologists, especially trainees, feel very guilty if they have to leave their seat to take lunch for like 5 or 10 minutes. They bring the lunch, they're just having lunch and then scrolling through images. So it's kind of an advice to all radiologists out there to probably take a 15-minute out of your day to go and have lunch, catch up with people, get a walk, and then come back, I guess.
So I think that you identify something important there. There should be no guilt associated with taking 15-minute breather, 20-minute breather, and eating your lunch in a focused manner, or spending time talking to a colleague about things that may not be work-related. And there should be no guilt associated with a breathing space in your day. When I try to do those walks, I will often try to do it with a colleague. Many people won't go or feel they can't go, but I'd rather leave, in my instance, 15 minutes later at the end of the day, but feel that I've refreshed myself in the course of the day. And I think even for people who have young children, that if you allow yourself some breathing space, you will be less stressed when you are with your family. I think there are certain things talking about family that are really important. I tried wherever possible. I have 2 children. I had them when I was relatively new on staff, but I tried however I could to be home to have dinner with my children as often as possible. And in this day, especially for you in radiology, where technologically you can do a lot of your work remotely, I think that's an important part of the day. There should be no guilt associated with taking time out to talk to your children, have a meal together, feel that you're a family, and the work can be done very often, which is what I would do after your children have gone to bed. It's not ideal, but it's better that you support your family and your partner than foregoing that. And because I think in the end that people become unhappy if they are giving up those very essential parts of their well-being and their family life on behalf of their work. And I think there is a way that we have to identify personally as to how we accommodate those important aspects.
Yes, that's brilliant, because in the constant pursuit of increased efficiency, I think we have lost the ability to just take a couple of minutes, smell the roses without feeling any guilt. In a healthcare context, we've been talking about mental health for physicians and healthcare workers. However, there's another big component, mental health of patients. Now, patients are here in the hospital. It's a new environment. It's very stressful. They have been given a new diagnosis. There's a lot of uncertainty with the diagnosis and treatment as well, potential side effects and complications. And to compound it all, especially due to our strained healthcare settings, there's always a longer wait time, which causes significant anxiety for patients as well. So what are the role do healthcare professionals need to play in not only taking care of the patient physically, but also for their mental well-being?
I would say that the simplest answer to that question is to look at the patient and their needs through the lens of, if you or your child or your partner or your parent was in that situation, how would you like the information to be communicated, and to be aware of using commonplace language that a patient can readily understand. And if you're communicating a difficult diagnosis, then to understand that you often will have to repeat what you've said, because people might be so stunned by the news as to be unable to absorb the information. Unfortunately, probably the best way to become the physician able to empathize with the patient is to, unfortunately, have been in that situation yourself, to have been with a child or a parent in a difficult situation and understand what it means to be dealt with compassionately, empathetically, and to allow the time to provide sufficient information to the patient. I think finally, in the context of radiology, one of the aspects was, how should medical technologists interact with patients? And from my own personal experience, I think we need to have a script. Very commonly, patients will inquire of the technologist doing the procedure as to the results. And that puts them in a very difficult position. And I think that is something that's important for the physicians and the radiologists in this situation, to appreciate the stress for the technologist and the fact that unclear information may be communicated. And so what I would suggest that you as a radiologist and your colleagues do is have a script. Have it clearly identified what you feel the technologists can freely say to the patient, and where they should not be able to give results, but to be able to say that in a way that's not threatening or uncomfortable for the patient. So in the end, it really does come down to being empathetic and putting yourself in the patient's shoes and giving the information in a way that they can comprehend, and allowing the time for people to absorb that and to repeat it if necessary.
It's often said that it takes a village to raise a child. In my mother tongue, there is another saying. It says that make sure that you raise your neighbor's kids really well, because the village will then raise your kid really well. What it kind of implies is that if you reach out, if you give to the community, if you provide support, you will receive that back in spades. We just heard how mental health is not just an individual responsibility, but it's a collective shared responsibility. There is a role for organizations and leaders, but then there is a role for each and every one of us. And probably all it takes are just few moments of the day. Just asking your colleague, how their weekend was. Just having a quick walk with them, sharing a coffee with them, sharing a joke with them, and laughing about life. These are few fleeting moments, and probably that's all that is needed to bring back joy to work. So make sure that you share your moments with your colleagues, not just those colleagues who reach out, but remember, in the words of the late Robin Williams, sometimes it is the saddest people who try hard to make other people happy because they know the feeling of loneliness and feeling unworthy. So just take a few moments out of your day to share your love, share your appreciation, and share your time with people around you. And that would bring joy to work. And if you want to experience joy in work, there's no better place than University Medical Imaging, Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Louise Harris, the inaugural UHN MD Wellness Lead, and me, your host, Satish Krishna. See you in the next one.